On a clear day, from the window of a plane cruising at 35,000 feet, you can see rivers, coastlines, the pale geometry of cities. You can see the shadow of a cloud moving across a mountain range. What you cannot see, what no astronaut has ever reliably seen with the naked eye from orbit, is the Great Wall of China. The textbook story said otherwise. For generations, schoolchildren were told that the Great Wall was the only man-made structure visible from space. It appeared in encyclopedias. It was repeated by teachers who had heard it from their own teachers. The idea had the comfortable ring of a proven fact, the kind of thing that made the wall seem almost supernatural in its scale. The blind spot here was a simple one. Nobody had actually verified it. The claim appears to have originated in a 1932 publication called Ripley's Believe It or Not, more than 30 years before any human being had ever left the atmosphere. It was a claim made in pure imagination, with no possible evidence to support it. And yet, it travelled from that page into the collective memory of the world. When Chinese astronaut Yang Liwei orbited Earth in 2003, journalists eagerly asked whether he had seen the wall. He had not. NASA later confirmed what opticians could have calculated all along. The wall is, at most, about 30 feet wide. From low Earth orbit, that is roughly the visual equivalent of spotting a human hair from 2 miles away. The geometry simply does not allow it. What this corrects is not merely a single fact. It corrects something about how myths become facts. The wall story survived for 70 years, not because anyone checked it, but because it felt true. It satisfied something in us. The desire for a human achievement so immense it could be seen from the heavens. The truth about the wall is that it is extraordinary enough without the myth. It stretches thousands of miles across some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. It was built across centuries by the labor of countless people whose names are unknown. That is wonder enough. But somewhere along the way, ordinary wonder was not sufficient. We needed it to be visible from the stars. The world simply stopped looking down. Another kind of myth is the one built around a person. Not a wall, but a man. Napoleon Bonaparte stood 5 feet 6 or 7 inches tall. By the standards of his era, he was of average height, possibly slightly above it. The soldiers under his command called him Le Petit Caporal, the little corporal. But this was a term of affection, not a description of his body. Junior soldiers often gave their generals diminutive nicknames. It was a gesture of familiarity. Napoleon was small in rank when they named him, not in stature. The established view held otherwise. For 2 centuries, Napoleon has been imagined as a short, imperious man, compensating for his size with his ambition. The caricature became so fixed that psychologists named a phenomenon after him, the Napoleon complex. The theory that short men overreach to compensate for height. The image was comfortable. It made him comprehensible. It turned a man who remade the map of Europe into a kind of joke. The confusion may have originated with a simple unit of measurement. Napoleon was recorded at 5 feet 2 inches in French units, which were longer than British inches. British cartoonist James Gillray then drew him as a tiny, raging figure, dwarfed by the men around him, and the image stuck. Gillray was creating propaganda, not portraiture. But propaganda outlasts its intentions. When historians returned to the records in detail, comparing Napoleon's height against the documented heights of his contemporaries, examining the accounts of people who stood next to him. The picture clarified. He was not tall. He was not short. He was ordinary, at a moment in history when ordinary men were changing the shape of civilization. The implications reach further than one man. The Napoleon myth tells us something about how we handle power. When a person achieves something that unsettles the order of the world, there is a deep human impulse to find a flaw, a wound, a deficit that explains it. He conquered half of Europe, not because he was a tactical genius and a product of his revolutionary moment, but because he was compensating. The myth makes the achievement smaller. It makes us safer. We can look at Napoleon and think, but he was small, and so the world remains legible, and so the world remains manageable. Comfort is a powerful editor of history. The flag was sewn in a back room in Philadelphia, or so the story goes. Betsy Ross, seamstress and patriot, summoned by George Washington himself, cutting and stitching the first stars and stripes by the light of a colonial window. For decades, historians assumed this was essentially accurate. The story had specific details. Ross's house on Arch Street still stands and is still visited by thousands of people a year. It had a named person, a named place, a named act. It felt like history rather than legend. The problem was the evidence. There was none. The first account of Betsy Ross sewing the flag appeared in 1870, nearly a century after the event it described. It was given by her grandson, William Canby, in an address to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. He claimed his grandmother had told him the story in 1857, when she was 84 years old, and he was 11. There were no contemporary documents, no letters, no invoices, no congressional records, no accounts from Washington, no confirmation from anyone who had been alive at the time. Historians have searched. They have looked through the payroll records of the Continental Congress. They have examined correspondence between the founders. No document placing Betsy Ross at the creation of the first flag has ever been found. What has been found are records of a seamstress named Frances Hopkinson, who submitted a bill to Congress in 1780 for designing several government seals, and who may have designed the flag. What this does not mean is that Betsy Ross was unimportant. She was a real woman, a skilled seamstress who ran her own business, who served her community, and who almost certainly made flags for the Continental Navy. The question is not whether she existed or mattered. The question is why America needed to believe she sewed the first one. There is something in this story about the human need for origin myths to have a face. Not a committee, not a gradual process, not a congressional debate, but one person, one room, one act of creation. The flag, like the nation it represents, was made by many hands over many years. That truth is harder to hold than the image of Betsy at her needle. The tidier the story, the further it often stands from what actually happened. The helmets had no horns. This is a statement that surprises people still, even people who already know it is true. The image of the Viking warrior, fur-clad, helmeted with great curving cattle horns, sailing into a grey northern sea, is one of the most vivid in the popular imagination. It is also, almost entirely, a product of 19th century opera and Romantic era painting. The established view, shaped not by medieval sources, but by theatrical costume designers and nationalistic artists of the 1800s, held that Norse warriors went to battle as living embodiments of the ancient gods. their helmets adorned with the symbols of sacrifice and ceremony. This was a mythology built by people who wanted to believe it, at a moment in European history when nations were constructing heroic pasts to justify present ambitions. The evidence told a different story. Almost no Viking Age helmets survive. Of those that do, the finest and most studied, the Gjermundbo helmet, found in a Norwegian burial mound in 1943, has no horns. It is a simple iron cap with a guard for the nose. Practical, unadorned, the kind of thing you wear when someone is trying to kill you. Horned helmets did exist in Scandinavia, but they predate the Viking Age by more than 1,000 years. The Vexo helmets, discovered in a Danish bog in 1942, are magnificent objects with sweeping bronze horns. They are ceremonial, dating to the Nordic Bronze Age, around 900 BCE. Wearing them into battle would have been absurd. The horns would have caught on every sword stroke and doorframe. They were made for ritual. They were made for the gods, not for war. What we learn from the horned helmet myth is something about the distance between image and truth in historical memory. The Vikings who sailed to America, who traded as far as Constantinople, who built a literate culture with a rich poetic tradition, have been reduced in the popular imagination to a single cartoon image that is centuries older than they are, and was invented by people who had never studied them. They were complex, they were violent and creative, and legal-minded and far-travelled. They deserved better than a costume. History is not a stage set, though we keep dressing it like one. The green of the Statue of Liberty was not its original colour. That much most people now know. What fewer people consider is how long the transformation took and what it means. When the statue arrived in pieces from France in 1885, she was the colour of a new penny, the warm reddish-brown of unoxidized copper. The patina that turned her green developed slowly over the following decades, the result of copper reacting with moisture, oxygen, and the salt air of New York Harbor. By around 1920, the transformation was essentially complete. The textbook story, which is really not a false story, but an incomplete one, focused on the transformation without asking what the original looked like, or what the change meant to the people who watched it happen. In the late 19th century, copper-coloured things were associated with industry and wealth. The new statue gleaming over the harbour was a monument in the colour of American commerce. What the gradual greening produced was something different and, in retrospect, more enduring. The verdigris, the technical word for this kind of copper patina, created a colour that no one had planned. It was not the colour the French sculptor Frédéric Bartholdi imagined. It was not the colour that American donors funded. It emerged from chemistry and weather and time, the way most beautiful things do. There is a quiet lesson in the patina. The statue is more beautiful and more universally recognizable in the colour it became than in the colour it was designed to be. The accident was the masterpiece. The change that no one planned turned out to be the version that endured. This happens more often in history than the textbooks suggest. The thing that was meant to be permanent is replaced by something that grew from it unexpectedly. The original is lost, and the transformed version is what the world remembers. The Statue of Liberty is green because the air touched it long enough. Time did the work that no one commissioned. Some of the most lasting things were never planned to last in quite the way they did. The Monopoly man wears a top hat He has a white moustache. He carries a cane and radiates a particular kind of early 20th century patrician excess. What he does not have, and has never had in any official Monopoly game, is a monocle. Vast numbers of people remember the monocle clearly. It is one of the most frequently cited examples of what psychologists call the Mandela effect, the phenomenon in which a large number of people share the same false memory. The term comes from the widespread false memory that Nelson Mandela died in prison in the 1980s, when in fact he was released in 1990 and died in 2013. The Monopoly man's phantom monocle is a small version of the same phenomenon. Why does the monocle appear in so many memories? The most plausible explanation is that the Monopoly man, officially named Rich Uncle Pennybags, resembles the popular image of another character who does wear a monocle, Mr. Peanut, the mascot of the Planters Peanut Company, two cartoon plutocrats from roughly the same era, both associated with old money and American consumer culture. In the memory, they blur. What the eye believes it has seen, it has often partly assembled. This matters more than it might seem. False shared memories of this kind reveal something fundamental about how human recall actually works. Memory is not a recording. It does not retrieve images the way a hard drive retrieves files. Memory reconstructs. Every time a memory is accessed, it is partly rebuilt from surrounding knowledge, expectations, and associations. The monocle appears because it belongs to the category cartoon wealthy man of the early 20th century. The brain fills in what fits. The implications reach far beyond party games and cartoon characters. Eyewitness testimony in criminal trials has been treated, for most of legal history, as among the most reliable forms of evidence. A person who saw something with their own eyes, who remembers it clearly, who is certain. This was considered near definitive. Modern psychology has overturned this almost entirely. Human memory, especially under stress, is extraordinarily susceptible to suggestion, contamination, and reconstruction. The monocle was never there. The certainty that it was is the whole point. Certainty and accuracy are not the same thing. They never were. A rat on a ship. This is where it begins, or where it ends, depending on how you look at it. The Black Death arrived in Sicily in October 3047, carried on 12 Genoese trading ships. The people who came to meet the ships found most of the sailors dead, and those still alive covered in black swellings that oozed blood and pus. The Sicilian authorities ordered the ships out of the harbour immediately. The ships left. The rats did not. The established view, repeated so often, it became part of the furniture of cultural memory, held that the Black Death killed roughly half of Europe's population. Half. The number has a tidy, terrible symmetry. 1 in 2. It was taught in classrooms and stated in documentaries as a settled fact. It made the 14th century seem like the apocalypse given form. The truth is more complicated and in some ways more disturbing. Modern historians, drawing on detailed regional records, parish registers, tax rolls, manorial accounts, have revised the death toll significantly. The consensus now places European mortality in the initial outbreak of 1347 to 1351 at somewhere between 30 and 60%. The range is wide because the plague did not move evenly. Some regions lost a quarter of their population, others lost nearly everything. The revision changes the meaning of the event without diminishing it. In fact, the unevenness is more haunting than the round number. The plague did not fall equally. It devastated some villages while leaving others nearly intact for reasons that were not understood and could not be predicted. The survivors could not know whether they had been spared by constitution or chance, or the direction of the wind. They lived with that uncertainty. What emerged from the Black Death was not simply a depopulated Europe. It was a transformed one. Labour became scarce. Peasants who survived found themselves with unprecedented bargaining power. The rigid feudal hierarchies that had defined European life for centuries began slowly to crack. The plague killed millions. It may also have helped end serfdom. History rarely offers straightforward horror. Even catastrophe contains a complicated aftermath. The monks who copied manuscripts in the medieval period knew that the earth was round. So did the sailors who navigated by the stars. So did the scholars who built their cosmology on Aristotle and Ptolemy, who had both argued for a spherical earth centuries before the Christian era. For decades, really for most of the 19th and 20th centuries, historians assumed that the common people of medieval Europe believed they lived on a flat plane, that the Church enforced this view, and that Columbus bravely sailed against the prevailing wisdom of his age. It was a story that served a particular historical agenda: the Middle Ages as the dark pit from which the Renaissance emerged, blinking into the light. The problem was that the primary sources did not support it. Medieval scholars were not flat earthers. Thomas Aquinas wrote about the spherical earth. Dante's entire cosmological vision in the Divine Comedy depends on a spherical planet. The journey through hell and up Mount Purgatory only makes spatial sense if the earth is a globe. The scholars who taught in medieval universities drew on classical geography that assumed spherical shape as a matter of course. The myth appears to have been largely invented, or at least crystallized, in the 19th century. Washington Irving's 1828 biography of Columbus portrayed the explorer as struggling against clergymen who believed the earth was flat. Historians have found no evidence that Columbus faced this argument. The actual dispute about his voyage concerned the size of the earth, not its shape. His critics argued, correctly, that Asia was too far west to reach in the time he planned. The flat earth myth tells us something about how historical periods get weaponized. Every age needs a prior age to stand above. The 19th century needed the Middle Ages to be ignorant so that its own scientific progress could seem more dramatic. We do this still. We flatten the past to make the present feel like an achievement. The earth was never flat in the minds of those who studied it. It was simply very large. The wooden horse stands in a clearing before the walls of Troy. The Greeks are gone. The Trojans drag it inside. That night, the soldiers inside emerge. The story is one of the most repeated in all of Western literature. It is the origin of the phrase Trojan horse. It appears in Homer. It appears in Virgil. It is taught to schoolchildren across the world as a piece of ancient history. And there is not a single piece of contemporary evidence that it ever happened. The Trojan War itself is a matter of genuine historical uncertainty. There was a city called Troy. Modern excavations at Izarlik in northwestern Turkey have identified multiple layers of occupation, and at least one layer shows signs of violent destruction around the 12th century BCE. Whether this destruction was caused by a Greek siege, and whether anything resembling the events of the Iliad occurred, remains unresolved. The horse does not appear in the Iliad at all. Homer's epic poem about the siege of Troy ends before the horse. The horse appears in later works, in the Odyssey, briefly, and in the Aeneid, written by Virgil in the 1st century BCE, more than 1,000 years after the events it describes. These are literary texts. They are not accounts written by witnesses. They are not even accounts written by people who claimed to be witnesses. What archaeology has found at Hisarlik is a city, walls, artifacts, evidence of trade and culture, and, eventually, fire. What it has not found is a giant wooden horse, or the remains of one, or any representation of one that predates the literary tradition. The horse may be a metaphor for a siege machine, for a deceptive maneuver, for the general use of strategy over force, or it may be purely invented. The honest answer is that we cannot know. The story is more than 3,000 years old. Perhaps what matters is what it has meant, and what it continues to mean to every culture that has retold it. Not whether it happened, but why it endures. Some stories are true in a way that facts cannot be. The city burned for 6 days and 7 nights. When it was over, much of ancient Rome lay in ash, and Nero, the emperor, played his fiddle. This image has travelled through 2,000 years of cultural memory with almost no erosion. The fiddling emperor, indifferent to suffering, possibly delighting in destruction. It is the perfect portrait of tyranny made personal. It has been cited, referenced, and invoked whenever the powerful seem indifferent to catastrophe. Almost none of it is accurate. To begin with the most literal point, the fiddle or violin did not exist in ancient Rome. It would not be invented for another 1,500 years. Roman musical instruments included the lyre and the cithara, stringed instruments, but nothing resembling a violin in construction or sound. If Nero performed anything during the fire of 64 CE, it was on one of these. The question of whether he performed at all is also unresolved. Tacitus, the Roman historian who wrote the most detailed account of the fire, says that some people claimed Nero sang about the fall of Troy while watching the city burn from a tower. But Tacitus also notes that Nero was actually in Antium, about 30 miles from Rome, when the fire broke out and rushed back to the city to organize relief efforts. He opened his own gardens to the homeless. He organized food supplies from nearby regions. This does not make Nero a good emperor. By most accounts, he was brutal and erratic. He almost certainly did have Christians blamed for the fire, and he almost certainly persecuted them for it. His reign ended in suicide when the Senate and military turned against him. But the image of the fiddling emperor is a caricature painted by his enemies, many of whom were writing decades after his death, when speaking ill of Nero was politically safe and historically fashionable. History is often written by those who survive the powerful, and survivors have interests. The record they leave is never neutral. The image is carved into 1,000 walls, written into 100 films, thousands of slaves in chains, beaten across the desert sand, dragging the stones of the pyramids under the eye of Egyptian overseers. It is one of the most durable images in popular history, reinforced by Hollywood and repeated by teachers, and embedded in the general picture of ancient Egypt as a civilization built on pure suffering. The textbook story held that the great building projects of ancient Egypt, and the pyramids above all, were accomplished by slave labor on a colossal scale. That this was the Egyptian model, the secret of the pharaohs, the human price of architectural immortality. Then, in 1990, a woman's horse stumbled in the desert near Giza. She was riding close to the pyramid complex when the animal's leg broke through into a concealed underground chamber. Archaeologists were called. What they found over the following excavations was a workers' village. It had bakeries producing industrial quantities of bread. It had breweries. It had a cemetery. The people buried there had been fed, housed, and, based on the skeletal evidence, given medical care. When their bones broke, they were set. When they showed signs of infection, they were treated. These were not the bones of slaves worked to death. Further work by archaeologist Mark Lehner and his team through the 1990s and 2000s built a detailed picture of the labor force. The workers appear to have been conscripted Egyptian peasants, men who rotated through in shifts, fulfilling a labor obligation to the state, and who returned home afterward. This is not a gentle story. Conscription is not freedom. The labor was brutal, and the conditions were punishing. But it is a different story from slavery. It suggests that the pyramids were built by Egyptian citizens, working under obligation, who were fed and cared for and buried with some dignity. The state depended on their labor, and it knew it. How we understand the pyramids changes how we understand Egypt. Not a civilization founded on the invisible suffering of an enslaved class. Something more complicated, a society capable of mobilizing its people on a scale that has never been equaled, and of sustaining that mobilization for generations. The stones remain. The story they tell is not the one we assumed. The ship was called the grandest vessel afloat. The newspapers called her a wonder. The White Star Line said she was the largest moving object ever built by human hands. What they did not say, and what the historical record suggests they carefully did not say, is that she was unsinkable. The established view, fixed in the cultural memory of the 20th century, held that the Titanic had been declared unsinkable by her builders and her owners, and that this hubris was part of the catastrophe. That pride preceded the fall, literally. It is a narratively satisfying story. It gives the disaster a moral architecture. The word unsinkable does appear in connection with the Titanic, but not in the way the myth suggests. A 1911 trade journal called The Shipbuilder, writing about the ship's watertight compartment system, used the phrase practically unsinkable. Not unsinkable, practically unsinkable. A qualified engineering claim about the technology, not a promise. White Star Line's promotional materials did not use the word. Captain Smith did not use the word. The architects did not use the word. What happened in the years after the sinking was a retroactive construction. Journalists, in trying to explain the inexplicable, why so many people had died when so much technology and money had been invested, reached for a narrative of hubris, and so the word appeared and spread and became the story. This matters because it changes the nature of the event. The Titanic sank not because anyone proclaimed her immune to disaster. She sank because she was moving too fast through ice-filled waters, because her watertight compartments did not extend high enough, because she carried too few lifeboats, and because the nearest ship that could have saved lives was running with its radio off. These are structural failures and human failures. They do not require a myth of hubris to be devastating. The truth is harder to forgive than the myth. Hubris is dramatic. Ordinary negligence is simply sad. There is no contemporary document, written in his own time, that names a man called Arthur as King of Britain. The legend is elaborate and ancient feeling. Camelot, Guinevere, the Round Table, the Sword in the Stone, the Knights, the Grail, the final battle at Camlan, the departure for Avalon. It has the texture of history. It has the weight of centuries of retelling. Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote a history of the kings of Britain in the 12th century that placed Arthur at the centre of the national story, and for centuries it was treated as a historical text. Historians now understand Geoffrey's work as largely invented. He claimed to have translated it from an ancient Welsh book, which no one has ever seen or verified. The details he provides, dates, genealogies, battles, cannot be confirmed from any independent contemporary source. The search for a historical Arthur has been one of the more persistent projects in British archaeology and history. The results are ambiguous. There is evidence of a real warrior tradition in post-Roman Britain, the period following the Roman withdrawal in the early 5th century, when the island fell into a chaos of small kingdoms and invasions. Some historians believe a real military leader may have existed, someone who temporarily unified resistance against the Anglo-Saxon advance. His name may have been Arthur, or something like it. But the Arthur of the legends, chivalric, Christian, crowned, presiding over a court of ethical knights in a stone castle, belongs entirely to the medieval imagination. He was built to serve the needs of each century that inherited him. 12th century kings found in him a model of Christian sovereignty. The Victorian era found in him a model of imperial virtue. Modern storytellers find in him whatever they need to find. He is a mirror, not a man, and mirrors tell us more about those who look into them than about whatever was on the other side. Before the great age of European exploration, historians once assumed most people never travelled far from where they were born. The world was vast and mostly impassable. People lived and died within a few miles of their birth. The horizon was a permanent boundary. The established view was shaped in part by the documentary record, which is deeply uneven. We know a great deal about merchants, soldiers, and kings who left behind contracts, chronicles, and maps. We know almost nothing about ordinary people, who left almost nothing at all. And because the record is silent, absence was taken for stillness. The problem was the assumption. Silence in the record does not mean absence in reality. It means the people in question were not writing things down, or that what they wrote did not survive, or that no one was interested in preserving it. Archaeological and genetic work done in the last 3 decades has overturned the picture almost entirely. Isotope analysis, a technique that can determine where a person lived by examining the chemical signatures left in their bones and teeth by the water and food they consumed, has been applied to ancient and medieval skeletons across Europe. The results are extraordinary. A significant proportion of people from every period showed evidence of having been born somewhere very different from where they died. Roman-era Britain shows individuals with origins in North Africa, the Middle East, and the far reaches of the Empire. Medieval European cemeteries contain people who grew up hundreds of miles away. Ancient burial mounds hold travellers who crossed entire continents. Trade networks that predate writing connected communities across enormous distances. The amber found in ancient Egyptian tombs came from the Baltic Sea. Silk from China arrived in European graves long before any official diplomatic contact between East and West. Obsidian from volcanic islands crossed water to reach communities that had no boats. Someone carried it. The ancient world was not a collection of isolated villages, each sealed in its own geography. It was a web of movement, exchange, and encounter. Most of the people who moved through it left no name. They left only the chemistry of their bones and the objects that travelled with them. The past was a crowded road. We simply stopped looking for footprints. The tower was not supposed to lean. Bonanno Pisano began construction on the bell tower of the Cathedral of Pisa in 1173. The soil on the south side of the foundation was too soft to support the structure's weight. By the time the third floor was complete, the tilt was already measurable. Construction stopped. For wars, for economics, for the practical reality of a building that was slowly tipping sideways. It remained incomplete for nearly 200 years. The textbook story framed the lean as the tower's defining quality, its reason for existing in the imagination. But the tower was not built to lean. It was built to stand straight, and it failed. The lean is an engineering disaster extended across 8 centuries. It is an accident that became a monument. The situation grew worse over time, not better. By the late 20th century, the tower had leaned to the point where structural engineers were calculating a possible collapse within decades. In 1990, the Italian government closed the tower to tourists and began an international competition to find a solution. What followed was one of the more careful and counterintuitive engineering projects of modern times. Rather than straightening the tower, which would have destroyed the very quality that made it famous, the engineers chose to reduce the lean slightly. They removed small amounts of soil from the north side of the foundation, allowing the tower to settle back by about half a degree. Not enough to make it straight, enough to make it stable. The project lasted a decade and was completed in 2001. The tower now leans at approximately 5 degrees. It is expected to remain stable for at least the next 200 years, which is longer than most human constructions of any kind. There is something worth sitting with here. The monument exists because of the failure. The failure was stabilized rather than corrected. The thing that was meant to be fixed was, instead, preserved just enough that it could endure without destroying itself. A great deal of what we call culture works the same way. The flaw is what makes it singular. The gunfight at the OK Corral lasted approximately 30 seconds. 20 to 30 shots were fired. 3 men died. That is the entire real event. A brief, chaotic exchange on a dusty street in Tombstone, Arizona in 1881, between 2 groups of men who had been quarreling over guns and jurisdiction for weeks. The established view of the American frontier, shaped by a century of Western films and novels and the enormous machinery of American myth-making, held that the West was a permanent war zone, that every town had a gunfight every week. That violence was the background rhythm of daily life, that every man wore a gun and used it, that the frontier was a lawless place where only the swift survived. The reality was different in almost every measurable way. Most Western towns had strict gun ordinances. Dodge City, perhaps the most famous of the frontier cattle towns, required visitors to check their firearms at the edge of town. Guns were not freely worn or carried. Homicide rates in most frontier towns were comparable to, or lower than, contemporary Eastern cities. Historical demographers who have studied the period in detail found that most years in most towns produced no murders at all. The famous shootouts were exceptions so rare they became nationally famous precisely because of their rarity. The gunfight at the OK Corral was reported in newspapers across the country because it was unusual. If it had been an ordinary Tuesday in Tombstone, no one would have written it down. The myth of the violent frontier served a purpose. It made the conquest of the West into a story of individual heroism rather than institutional violence. The actual displacement of indigenous peoples, the role of the federal government and the railroads, the land grabs and broken treaties. These were slow, structural, bureaucratic processes. They did not fit the grammar of a gunfight. And so, the gunfight became the story. The real West was more complicated, more ordinary, and in the end, more tragic than the story that replaced it. Most pirates did not bury treasure. They spent it. A pirate ship in the golden age of piracy, roughly the 1650s to the 1730s, was an unstable economy. The crew were shares in the voyage, not wages. When a prize was taken, it was divided aboard according to a charter agreed upon before sailing. The captain took more than the ordinary sailor, but not by as much as one might expect. Pirate vessels were run on something closer to a rough democracy than a hierarchy. Everyone knew what everyone else had earned. There was no treasury to bury. The established view, built almost entirely on the novels of Robert Louis Stevenson and the illustrations that accompanied them, imagined a world of chests on beaches, treasure maps with X marks, and old buccaneers with secrets. Treasure Island was published in 1883. It was fiction. It was acknowledged as fiction. And yet, its imagery colonized the popular understanding of piracy so thoroughly that the treasure map became the emblem of the pirate world. There is exactly one documented case of a pirate burying treasure. Captain William Kidd, who buried some of his takings on Gardiner's Island in New York in 1699, shortly before his arrest. He apparently did this as a bargaining chip, evidence he could trade for clemency. The treasure was recovered within weeks by the colonial governor. There was no map. There was no mystery. It lasted about a month in the ground. What the real pirates did with their earnings was ordinary and human. They spent it on drink, on lodging, on women, on gambling. Some sent money home. Some bought their way into respectable life on shore. The ones who were not caught disappeared into the ports of the Atlantic world, becoming merchants, farmers, tradesmen, unremarkable people with complicated pasts who kept their mouths shut. The buried treasure persisted because endings matter in stories. Treasure on a ship disappears into the noise of commerce. Treasure in the ground becomes a mystery. And a mystery is always more interesting than a spent evening. When European settlers arrived in North America, they described an empty wilderness, untouched forest, unbroken prairie, land that had never felt a human hand. The continent was framed as a gift of nature, waiting to be used, waiting as if it had always been waiting, as if patience were the land's defining quality. The established view, which shaped both the self-understanding of colonial settlers and the legal frameworks they built, held that the land was essentially unoccupied, terra nullius, empty earth. What happened to the indigenous peoples who were visibly present was managed through a combination of legal fiction, wishful thinking, and deliberate misrepresentation. The people were acknowledged just enough to be displaced, and then written out of the founding story almost entirely. The problem was that the continent was not empty. It had been inhabited for at least 15,000 years. At the time of European contact, estimates of the indigenous population of North America range from 5 million to over 18 million people, depending on the methodology used. These were not scattered nomads, wandering without purpose or permanence. They were farmers, city builders, traders, and engineers. They had cleared vast portions of the eastern forest for agriculture. They had established trade networks that moved copper from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, that carried obsidian and shells and ideas across mountain ranges and river systems. They had built urban centers, the largest of which, Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, had, at its peak, around 1100 CE, a population larger than contemporary London. What made the land appear empty by the time sustained European colonization began was a catastrophe that preceded most of the colonizers themselves. European diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, moved ahead of European settlement, carried by early contact and indigenous trade networks. In some regions, 90% of the population died before a single settler arrived to see the result. The forests that looked primeval had been cleared and had grown back. The prairies that looked untouched had been managed by fire for generations. The emptiness was freshly made. It was, in the most precise sense, a wound still closing when the first wagons rolled through it. Charles Mann, in his 2005 book, 1491, helped bring this revised picture to a wider public. Drawing on work by archaeologists, ecologists, and historians across decades, the book argued that pre-contact America was not a wilderness, but a managed landscape, one that had been shaped by human hands for millennia, and whose apparent wildness was in large part the aftermath of an unprecedented demographic collapse. The wilderness the settlers described was a graveyard they mistook for a garden. What was empty was not the land. It was the story that was told about it. And into that emptiness, an entire mythology was built. A mythology that required the emptiness to be natural, eternal, and undeniable. Because if the land had always been empty, no one had lost it. And if no one had lost it, nothing needed to be grieved. In 1887, a French newspaper called the construction of a new iron tower on the Champ de Mars a blot on the city. 300 artists and intellectuals signed a petition calling it an eyesore, a disgrace, a factory chimney made of bolts. Guy de Maupassant reportedly ate lunch inside it every day, because it was the only place in Paris from which he could not see it. The story is almost too perfect. A writer so offended by a structure that he took his meals inside it, sheltering from his own distaste. The established view, still repeated frequently, holds that the Eiffel Tower was deeply unpopular when it was built, and that time simply changed the public's mind. This is true as far as it goes, but it flattens something. It is worth being more precise about what the objection was and what exactly changed. The tower was built for the 1889 World's Fair, marking the centennial of the French Revolution. It was explicitly temporary. The plan was to dismantle it after 20 years. The critics who objected to it were not, for the most part, objecting to the principle of modern engineering. France was proud of its engineering. They were objecting to the aesthetics, the exposed ironwork, the industrial scale, the absence of ornamentation. To eyes trained on Haussmann's Paris, on stone and symmetry and classical references, the tower looked unfinished. It looked like the skeleton of a building waiting for its skin. It looked like something left behind by construction, rather than something built on purpose. What changed was partly time and partly function. The tower proved its value as a radio transmission antenna, which gave the government a practical reason to keep it standing beyond the original deadline. And then the world wars came, and the tower stayed, and the city's face changed around it. And the thing that had seemed alien gradually became the anchor of the skyline. Paris grew into the tower the way a tree grows around a fence post. Slowly, then completely, until the intrusion and the organism became a single thing. Gustave Eiffel himself seems to have understood that time was on his side. He was not a man who raged against his critics. He furnished the top floor with a private apartment for himself and spent many evenings there, looking out over the city he had marked forever. He invited scientists to use the tower for atmospheric experiments, for wind measurements, for meteorological research. He made it useful in ways that had nothing to do with spectacle. He made it permanent before it was officially made permanent. He understood that a thing which serves a purpose is harder to destroy than a thing which only stands. The tower is now the most visited paid monument in the world. It receives around 7 million visitors a year. The petition against it is a historical curiosity, reproduced in books about the short-sightedness of taste. The men who signed it are remembered, if at all, for having been wrong, which is a particular kind of immortality, and not the one they were seeking. Some things require time to become themselves. The city simply needed to grow into the space the tower made. Open a standard world map, the kind found in classrooms and offices and the backs of textbooks, and Greenland appears roughly the same size as Africa. It is shown as an enormous landmass stretching across the top of the map in imposing white and grey. Africa, by contrast, looks manageable, contained, moderate in scale. The reality is nearly the inverse. Africa is approximately 14 times larger than Greenland. The entire continent of North America fits inside Africa with room to spare. The United States, Europe, China, India, and a significant portion of the rest of the inhabited world can be placed inside Africa's actual borders and still not fill it. The distortion is a product of the Mercator projection, a method of representing the spherical surface of the Earth on a flat rectangle. The projection was created in 1569 by Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator for a specific and practical purpose: navigation. The Mercator projection preserves angles accurately, which means that a compass bearing drawn as a straight line on the map is a true course on the ocean. For sailors in the age of sail, it was invaluable. What it does not preserve is area. The mathematical trade-off required to represent angles accurately means that land masses are progressively distorted as they approach the poles. Greenland, which sits at a high latitude, appears roughly equal in size to Africa, which straddles the equator. The actual land areas are not remotely comparable. This distortion is subtle because it operates on intuition rather than measurement. Few people memorize the square mileage of continents, but nearly everyone carries a mental image of the world. That image is often inherited from maps encountered repeatedly in schools, atlases, news broadcasts, and offices. When a particular representation becomes familiar enough, it stops feeling like an interpretation and starts feeling like reality. Alternative projections. The Peters projection, the orthograph, the Winkel triple attempt to represent areas more accurately at the cost of distorting shapes or angles. No flat map can perfectly represent a sphere. The question is only which distortions to choose. The Mercator projection endured not because of malice, but because of inertia. It was the map that existed. It was the map that got printed and distributed and taught. By the time its distortions became widely understood, it had shaped the visual imagination of the world. Maps do not merely record geography, they influence perception. The features that appear largest command attention, while those that appear smaller can seem less significant than they are. A projection designed to solve a navigational problem ended up shaping generations of assumptions about the relative scale of countries and continents. We learned the size of things from a map that was built for ships. We are still unlearning it. The world, it turns out, is a different shape than we were shown. It always was. The map just made it easier not to notice.